So first of all, you're all very, very welcome for coming. Before we begin, I'd just like to extend a sincere thanks to Commissioner Bachelet for coming to speak to us today. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate her taking time out of her very busy schedule, I'm sure. Before we get into the interview, I'd just like to say a few things about the Law Society itself and about the award that Commissioner Bachelet is being awarded today. So the Law Society was founded in 1933, and for 87 years, the Society has strived to provide its members with opportunities to socialize, to engage in discourse, and to experience new phenomena. The Praeses Elit Award is an integral part of that endeavor. It is given to those who have left an indelible impact in their chosen field and who have advanced discourse and societal thought in the process. The award was founded by Mary Robinson, former auditor of the Law Society, and of course, the first female president of Ireland. Rarely bestowed, the recipients of this honour include Sir Bob Geldof, Sarah Rafferty, Max Schrems, Lord Newberger, and Samantha Power. And recipients this year include Niall Breslin, Stephen Fry, and Nicola Sturgeon, to name but a few. This year in particular, the Law Society wishes to place an emphasis on empowering students not only in their careers, but in their everyday lives. And it is for this reason that Commissioner Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has been nominated. Ms. Bachelet is a Chilean politician who served as President of Chile from 2006 to 2010, and again from 2014 to 2018 for the Socialist Party of Chile. She was the first woman to occupy the position. Having left the presidency in 2010, she was appointed the first executive director for the newly created United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Gender Empowerment of Women. In August 2018, Ms. Bachelet became United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, a position she remains in to date. Her story, a tale of perseverance, bravery, and intellect, is undoubtedly worthy not only of commendation, but a sincere thank you on behalf of all young people who wish to grow up in a world where democratic values are commonplace. So without further ado, and with particular thanks to our sponsors, Evershed Sutherland, it is my sincere pleasure to, albeit unfortunately virtually, present Ms. Bachelet with the 2020 Praeses Elit Award. I'm not sure if you got it at the post beforehand or anything, but as far as I know, it's on the way. I don't know if you'd like to offer a few words of acceptance or anything like that, or whether you'd like to go straight into the interview.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I feel really honored for this award, and I'm sorry that it has to be virtual, but okay, in some minute I will go back to Ireland as well. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. So we'll just get straight into the Q&A. So having done a little bit of research before this, it was clear that you experienced kind of gross human rights violations early on in your life under the Pinochet, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, regime. So I was just wondering, how did this affect you in terms of your advocacy for human rights? And would you credit those early life experience to your career in politics, or had you known before that you wanted to go into politics?
Well, I credit mainly my family education, because my parents were really persons who believed that everybody, because of the main reason of being human beings, deserve to all their rights to be protected and so on. So more than the Pinochet regime. Probably I went into politics because I believe so much in human rights. I believe so much to stop inequalities, because they were a terrible thing to see. So, I mean, of course, the Pinochet regime, what it meant is that it was experience that for us, because we believed, you know, in Chile, we thought we were like the Swiss of Latin America, you know, like always stable and serious and so on. We were not, but we thought we were special. So for us, it was like a terrible surprise to have a coup d'etat, because we were supposed to be a democratic country. So to have a military coup for us was something completely unexpected. And then, of course, what came with it, all the human rights violation to so many people, even my father, who died in prison because of torture. And then me and my mom were also jailed. So of course, it was important, but I was already in politics before that. And for me, human rights were important since I was a child, because that was how I was raised.
Okay. And do you think that obviously experiencing on one hand a democratic nation, and then on the other hand, obviously being under a military regime, do you think that strengthened your resolve in politics at all? Or do you think you would still be as passionate without?
Well, I think, I mean, it did change a little bit. I mean, what would I say? I think what it made me was to be more resilient. At the beginning, I had so much anger and I was so mad with everything because my father died, me and my mom had to go out of the country. We went to Australia and then to Germany. So I was really, really mad. If I may say, how, not revenge, but something very strong inside. But suddenly I start thinking, no, what I want to do in life is exactly the things that will never happen this again in my country or any other part of the world. I mean, it's not revenge. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted us to be able, the Chileans, to be able to live and to coexist in a friendly manner, in a peaceful manner, to understand that somebody can think differently, but it's not my enemy. It can be my adversary, but it's not my enemy. So that's what I did, and that's why I studied military issues, because I thought for the militaries, they don't understand politicians. So I need to understand the armed forces, understand security issues. So I studied that, but in the idea of bridging worlds that were completely separated.
Okay.
And that's, I think, something I've done my whole life, try to bridge, gaps, try to put people together, try to make people dialogue and be able to understand. They might not agree, but try to understand the other people's point of view. And I think because I'm pretty empathic on one hand, but also because I'm pretty resilient. And I think my experience in life helped me on that.
Brilliant. We could definitely use a lot more of that in today's world for sure. So obviously later on in your career, you were elected the President of Chile. And I was just wondering, what were the greatest challenges of this role? And were there challenges that kind of presented themselves only once you got into the role, or had you anticipated everything that you faced?
No, I didn't anticipate anything when I was a candidate for this post. First of all, I didn't anticipate that there was a so big pushback against human rights, and I had not anticipated that. But I would tell you my strategic priorities are, first of all, to recover from the pandemic, and that means to build back better. Because I mean, if we have learned something, I mean, not learned because I knew that from before, as I already mentioned to you, is that what the pandemic has laid bare is the huge inequalities inside countries and among countries as well. I mean, no country was prepared for this. And if you see who the virus affects everyone, but impacts disproportionate the most vulnerable, the poorest, the minorities, women and girls, LGBTI communities, older people, people living with disabilities, indigenous people. So we shouldn't try to go back to the day before the pandemic started. We should try to rebuild better this world. And that means inclusive economy. It means more greener economies as well, sustainable development, more equal and just societies that will be more resilient to future crises, because we need also to recognize the urgency of addressing climate emergency. I think what is one of our hugest problems. But another priority, and I know that for Ireland is very important as well, is what we call civic space. Civic space is the environment that enable people and groups to participate meaningfully in political, economic, social, and cultural life on their societies. And that means to support human rights defenders, for example, people who are activists and so on. So people need to be able to freely express themselves on issues such as access to healthcare, water, education, but also to be able to give feedback to states delivering on their obligations. So civic space has increasingly moved online. The UN just issued a guidance on civic space, which commit us all to be more attentive to these issues. And I will also highlight, it's a lifelong priority of mine, is gender equality and equal opportunity for women and girls. So I think this is also a huge priority, because it's half of humanity and who is being discriminated, and we need to do much more on that as well.
Absolutely. You mentioned there in your priorities just kind of very basic human rights standards, and one thing that the UN Human Rights Council and other international human rights bodies are often criticized are often criticized on the basis of is that they include member states that are considered to have very poor human rights records. And I was just wondering, like, what do you feel is the best response to that criticism?
Well, my first comment will be no country is perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, I've gone to those countries who are usually shown like the perfect ones, and still when you meet people from the civil society or people from Roma groups and so on, they will say, or indigenous groups, they will say that they feel discriminated, even they're fantastically because of course they have more respect for human rights than other countries, but there's no perfect countries. At the same time, no state is immune from scrutiny of the human rights record, whether they are a member of the council or not. So no state can conceal a human rights violation they may have committed, nor escape criticism by sitting on the Human Rights Council. Quite the opposite, in fact, because to be sitting in the Human Rights Council, it means that you have to sort of show that you're respecting human rights. Because first of all, when you want to be a candidate, you have to pledge certain things, and then you have to fulfill those pledges. So, for example, as of January this year, 2021, 119 of the 103 UN member states will have served as a member of the Human Rights Council. So I think this expresses on one hand the UN's diversity, but also gives the Council legitimacy when speaking out of human rights situation around the globe. Because as I said, also with the membership of the Council comes with the responsibility to uphold human rights standards. So this is a criteria insisted on by state themselves when they adopted Resolution 60/251 in March 2006 to create the Human Rights Council.
Okay, brilliant. And you mentioned just before that, obviously, that one of your main strategic aims is to promote gender equality. And as inaugural executive director of UN Women, how do you think that women's rights and human rights intersect, and how do you use your role as High Commissioner to promote women's rights as human rights?
Well, Hillary Clinton in Beijing 25 years ago said, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. So this is not just a slogan, dear to feminist movements in the 90s. It's a pillar of the demand for equality, if I may say. Women's rights are human rights requires acknowledging that women are only 25% of parliamentarians, for example. On average, they earn 23% less than men. For work of equal value, and they shoulder 3/4 of care work. So they're not just facts of life, they are the result of structural gender-based discrimination. So this therefore requires states to take targeted, adequate and deliberate steps to promote equality. It means that women's rights should not be dependent on the changing winds of politics. States have an obligation to respect, protect and fulfill women's rights at all times and can be held accountable for it. I think in the current climate of attacks against human rights, women's rights are often the first in the line of fire, if I may say. The human rights-based approach to gender equality promoted by my office argued that we cannot tear apart the women's rights agenda. So we cannot promote women's empowerment without guaranteeing they can control their bodies and their lives. We cannot protect women from violence without promoting their autonomy, including their economic, social, and cultural rights.
And just on that note as well, you mentioned before that when you were elected the President of Chile, you felt that if you had failed, it would be a reflection not only on you, but on your gender as a whole. And I was just wondering what challenges are faced by women in leadership positions, and were there any double standards that you have faced personally in your career?
Well, I have faced a lot of challenges, but it's a common impression. I mean, when I speak to other women who have been president or prime ministers, they all have gone through something like women in leadership position will face still resistance, suspicion, and sometimes even hostility, based on the hard-to-die stereotypes, if I may say, about their capabilities and their place in society. As someone who has been a lot of firsts, because I mean, it's not because I'm fantastic, it's because a few women are there. I have been the first women Minister of Defense in my country, but the 5th in the history of the world. Can you imagine? That's not because I'm fantastic, because women are always in a second place. You know? I have been first woman head of state in my country, but I did face challenges. And I think the impact of gender on the treatment of leaders manifests in very different ways, from complacency to patronizing, to mistrust, and to open opposition. And it manifests in a way in which the media reports on you for some time. I mean, I wouldn't care, I wouldn't mind if somebody discusses my ideas because they cannot agree on that, but the size of my purse or the way I dress, or if I'm big or not, I mean, in the attacks of your opponent, for example, or focusing on your physical appearance or the life of your children, or even the behavior of collaborators and colleagues in your own political party. So when I question myself on how to establish my authority in a still male-dominated environment, I decided, when I was Minister of Defense, for example, I decided I would do it my way. I have a style of leadership and I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't try to look as a man. I mean, to behave as a man. If people do not respect me because I'm like I am, that's their problem. I will do my thing. And I think that by natural inclination and sometimes by socialization, women have qualities and skills that are extremely important in leadership position in terms of empathy, on sometimes on how you communicate things and so on. And let me pass the commercial. I couldn't stop myself from doing it. In the first wave of the pandemic, there was 12 countries who had the best, if I would say, response. Of those 12, 7 were led by women. So all these stereotypes that women cannot make hard decisions, that women are not decisive enough and so on, completely false. I think that they listened to expert advice, they took decisive action, and were effective and compassionate in communicating with the people. So they did and still doing an amazing job. I tell this because I think we must celebrate the achievements of women leaders. This can go a long way. I mean, the Prime Minister of New Zealand just won another election fantastically as well, and so on. So I think it's important that women and men can be great leaders. And I think, I mean, it's not that one are better than the other, but both can be great leaders.
Yeah. You mentioned there the kind of the value of scientific advice, and obviously now we're living in an era that has seen a massive backlash against expertise and the value of scientific inquiry. And a recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur mentioned that academic freedom is protected by human rights principles and that it is more than just a subset of the right to free expression. So I was just wondering, why do you think we should care about academic freedom from an international human rights perspective?
Well, just last week, I joined the heads of UNESCO and WHO, and we made a joint appeal for open science. This was a principle, life-saving and urgent call to ensure, I would say, the broadest possible sharing of scientific knowledge and the broadest possible access to the benefits of scientific knowledge. So what is true for information more general is also true for academic freedom. The free flow of information and access to truthful, evidence-based information, I think, are best weapons in a pandemic context, in fact, in any context, really. I'm convinced that any attempts to silence people's voices or their views and feedback are counterproductive. Transparency and meaningful participation, I think, are key for building trust. And trust is something that we see in democratic societies a little bit lacking. So I think that new technologies have also vast potential to bring more voices to the table. And I think COVID-19 has shown us how reliant we are on technology and how digital tools can create avenues for people to participate in the public debate and give feedback on the effectiveness of response measures, for example. Now, new technology, however, carry also risk, as they can allow surveillance, censorship, or targeting those who speak up at previously unknown scale. So I think a right-based approach to the design and use of new technologies is therefore essential, as are proactive efforts to close the digital divide, open up the use of safe digital tools to ensure wide and diverse participation of a variety of actors is essential.
And just on a more general human rights perspective, I suppose, obviously states have varying obligations with regards to a right to health, the right to education, right to food, etc. But obviously, given the gross issues, I suppose, with the distribution of wealth. Many states simply don't have the resources to live up to their human rights obligations. So I was just wondering, from your perspective, how can we reconcile the demands of international human rights law with the vast disparities in wealth and capacity across states?
Well, I mean, I could tell you two things. First of all, that human rights are not an option. It's not a luxury nor something we can live without. So they are the bedrock of our democracies and of healthy, peaceful, and resilient societies. International human rights law requires states to allocate and use efficiently their resources toward the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, prioritizing the most vulnerable and marginalized segments of society. So I think the first of all is to take the right priorities. You have to make decisions and prioritize. No? And the second thing, of course, you can do everything at the same time. You will have to, it will be a gradual, probably increase in human rights in countries who don't have enough resources. But even if the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights envisages the progressive realization of economic and social and cultural rights. So states are still required to ensure the enjoyment of minimum essential levels of each right as a matter of priorities using their maximum available resources. But budgets should be ring-fenced to ensure that essential goods and services are universally accessible and to ensure at least, I would say, essential levels of enjoyment of these rights, including access, for example, to essential medicines and primary health care for the right to health, access to sufficient, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food, and freedom from hunger for the right to food, universal, free, and compulsory primary school for the right to education, for example. So the obligation for states to use the maximum available resources should be understood in a broader framework of how states mobilize resources, both domestically and of course through international cooperation as well, using all the macroeconomic tools at their disposal. So I would say to dedicate the maximum available resources to promote the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights will require, among others, for example, progressive taxation measures, strengthening the capacity to collect taxes, because in many countries, you think they're poor, but they have more than what you think, but they do not collect taxes adequately, or they don't fight tax evasion, for example. Tackling corruption is another issue. We are countries who are not poor, but there's a lot of corruption and other forms of abuse. So I think all these measures would contribute to effectively redistributing resources, creating the necessary fiscal space to protect human rights, and combating inequality and discrimination in the short and long term.
Obviously, we spoke about distribution of wealth as a problem there. Obviously, the most pressing issue facing us today is the COVID-19 pandemic. I was just wondering, what are the most significant ways in which the pandemic has had a negative impact on international human rights? And as well as that, how can we draw the line between a reasonable and an unreasonable public health measure that restricts personal freedoms in the name of combating the virus?
Well, I think, of course, COVID-19 is a health crisis, but much more than a health crisis. And I think the socioeconomic impacts of the crisis are extremely concerning. And I'm not sure we have seen it yet. I mean, the whole impact. Of course, we have the access to health, the effect of confinement and isolation on mental health, access to education, increasing unemployment. We may be looking at the first increase of global poverty since the late 90s. Working condition of health and care staff have also been a source of preoccupation. Measures adopted to contain the spread of the virus have been affecting people's daily lives and human rights. Many states are implementing extraordinary and restrictive measures, including formal states of emergency, and of course, international human rights laws permit that in case of disasters or pandemics or things like that. But these measures should be proportionate to their situation. They should have certain, how could I say it? They should be times that are defined, and it could restrict certain human rights, but not other ones. And some countries have used it as an excuse the COVID-19 pandemic, to restrict civic space, to limit freedom of expression, to limit freedom of press. I mean, you can limit freedom of mobility or assembly, and that's okay because you are doing it because of a health reason. But there's, and you have a focus and a duration, and we should, anything that is needed should take the least intrusive approach possible to protect public health. So I think, because more than ever, I think the voice of the people need to be heard. Civil society can help identify flexible, gender responsive, and smart solutions that respond to the most urgent needs. One interesting thing the other day in a meeting, I was hearing Michael Ryan, he's an Irish, and he is in charge of the committee on the response of the emergency. And he was mentioning that Thailand, for example, Thailand is a country who doesn't have too much resources, but because they have a very focus on primary care and community response, that they are doing great, because it's in the community, they do take decisions that are the best for everyone. So I think that an open, inclusive, and vibrant civic space helps ensure targeted and candid feedback on COVID-19 measures to improve the response.
Okay, and obviously, given the pandemic, there's been kind of another rise again of authoritarianism and far-right policies kind of feeding on people's fear of the virus, I suppose. And I was just wondering, what are the specific threats posed by the rise of authoritarianism regarding human rights on a global scale? And as a citizen, what's the best thing that you can do on an individual level to try and protect human rights?
I mean, first of all, I think what we are witnessing today shows our interconnectedness. I mean, we are so interconnected, and the importance to foster solidarity, to save lives and protect human rights. Because if my neighbor is not safe, I'm not safe. If a neighboring country is in danger, my country is equally in danger. So until everyone is safe, no one is safe. So we are all in this together. And I think that's the main issue we need to communicate, from individuals to government, from civil society and grassroots communities to the private sector. Everyone has a role to re-emerge, if I may say, stronger and more resilient for present and future generations. The challenges, be it climate change or COVID-19, that we all face, no borders. There's no border for that. So if we all embrace the duty to protect human rights, we will be in a better world. We can volunteer, we can financially support civil society organizations that provide services to vulnerable groups, for example. The protection and promotion of human rights is not limited to governments and the United Nations. We all have a role to help create an environment that respects human rights, and this applies also to business and to the private sector as well. Because human rights build hope, and we need hope in the world, to be able to every day wake up, go and do your things. You need hope, and they bind humanity together with shared principles and better future, in sharp contrast to the divisive, destructive force of repression, exploitation, scapegoating, discrimination, and inequalities.
You mentioned just before that, you mentioned Michael Ryan, a good Irishman. With Ireland assuming a seat on the UN Security Council in 2021, how can we use our presence on the council to promote human rights from an Irish perspective?
Well, Ireland has pledged to return to multilateralism to solve global challenges, and it has gained such experience through its engagement as a member of the European Union. So Ireland also brings to the table a deep understanding of the human rights impact of crisis, including famine, mass migration, and violence faced by much of the world's population. I think a commitment to human rights, including gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, are central priority of your foreign policy and international aid, which we anticipate will carry over into its work on the Council as well. Furthermore, as an island nation, or just under 5 million people, if I'm not wrong, Ireland can also give a voice on the Council to smaller island nations, which face the higher threat of climate change. Ireland has been a key ally on civic space and human rights defenders, and my office and I are very grateful for that commitment. Civil society faces numerous obstacles when national security and counterterrorism are discussed, but all of these issues are interlinked with discrimination and lack of respect for human rights more generally. So to ensure, I would say, truly sustainable peace, we need to make space for different perspectives and voices to be heard at the Security Council. And I'm sure Ireland can be very helpful on that regard.
Brilliant. Sounds good to me. So I suppose just on a broader level, just one more question from me before we open it to questions from those who are watching. When you leave your office as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, what kind of legacy do you want to leave, and what kind of world do you envisage?
Well, I haven't thought on a legacy really. I have tried, what I have probably done since I arrived here is to ensure that our concept of human rights as an office is not only based on political and civil rights, those are very important, but I have tried to insist that we need also to work very strongly on social, economic, and cultural rights on one hand. And of course, it's important on human rights that there's no impunity, but the main thing that I care for, and I've tried to work strongly on that, is that we have, human rights are violated in so many different ways, but mainly what you have there is inequalities who are behind. So how can we really, if I may say, not only describe, not only, I mean, we need to speak out every time we need to speak out, but we need to understand the root causes of human rights, the root causes of inequalities, and we need to work on those root causes, because otherwise we will not be able to eliminate human rights violations. So I've been working on that. On the other hand, the other thing that I have been trying to do is to engage with governments, because it's true, according to the international human rights law, by only states violate human rights. I mean, non-state actors, we call it abuses, not violations. So that's why of course, I can name and shame when it's needed, but I want to engage member states so they really are able to. In some cases, states do not protect human rights always, but not necessarily intentionally. Sometimes they don't have the capacity. They don't have a strong rule of law, for example, or your judiciary system is not strong enough. So what I want is to engage states and governments, parliament, and of course, judiciary system, to be able to make them have better capacity to respond to the people and to avoid violation of human rights. So I try to work with a lot of cooperation and collaboration with member states. Of course, when it's needed to name and shame, I do it, but I also try to support them in being able to improve, because no country is perfect. There's no country that's perfect. What world we love to see in the future? Well, a more, I would say, inclusive world where human rights are respected, and when men and women have equal rights and equal opportunities, and that we can also, that everyone could enjoy human rights.
Maybe one without the coronavirus as well would be.
Well, you know what? I thought that the coronavirus pandemic could help us to understand better the human rights issues. But for my surprise, I mean, I would have thought that the world would respond in a collaborative way. Because what I feel is that the world has lost the sense of collectiveness. We have seen all this emerging populism, nationalism, and so on. I thought, okay, COVID-19 might help us. I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen yet states reacting in a more positive way, but I'm optimistic strategically. So I hope we can learn from this.
Hopefully. There's just a few questions here from people that are watching. One of them is, do you think the human rights discourse has to be seen purely from politics discourse, or normative aspects have to be strengthened?
Well, I think, normative aspect can always be improved, because you can face issues that I mean, even though I have to tell you, I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's offline and online. I mean, you don't need to change it. And usually I wouldn't try, because it's like a Pandora box. I mean, in today's world that is so polarized and politicized, that if you open a discussion on this, you don't know where it's going to end, that discussion. So what we have today in the world, we have a very strong UN, if I would say, human rights system not only the Office of the High Commissioner, but we have the treaty bodies, we have the special procedures, the special rapporteurs, we have the Human Rights Council. All of that can be improved. And now in this year, we are in a review of the human rights treaty bodies and to make it more efficient, more effective, and so on. And it will end with a resolution of them. And I hope more funded, because we are, we're supposed to be the third pillar of the UN, peace and security, development, and human rights, but we only receive 3.7% of the regular budget, of the budget that's paid by member states. The rest is all voluntary contribution from donors. So I would say, I think it is a political issue because human rights are political. But but we have a pretty important system, human rights system, and I think it needs to be improved and better funded.
Okay. And another question is, what is your opinion on gender quotas within business and parliaments? There are arguments against gender quotas that claim that such quotas infantilize women and do not fairly judge candidates based on merit. So what would your response be to this?
Well, when you have a discrimination, you need special measures. If you give everyone the same, you will always have the one who are left behind being left behind. That's my experience in life. And why does people believe that gender quotas, I mean, many times that I argue on this, people will tell me, no, but we need good people. And I said, why don't ask that yourself when they're men? I mean, of course we need good women, but also good men, if, for example, for parliament. And in my experience, in my last government, I decided to start in the business sector, but in that I could decide. So I'm a state-owned enterprises. So when I started the government, it was 4.6% of members of board were women, and I finished with 46%. So, and it really did very good. But also when we had the crisis at the end of the 90s, the economic crisis, companies who had more women on board did very well. So that's why the Norwegian decided to have a minimum quota on boards, 40%, I believe, or something like that, and minimum, and they did very well. And then the European Union started discussing about it. I don't remember what happened afterwards, because at that time I was at Young Women. But I believe that when you have a difference, you need to give special measures. So otherwise, they will always be in a worse situation. Maybe there will be one day the world won't need any quotas. But today, sometimes you need quotas for youth, for indigenous groups. I mean, people who are underrepresented, and you need the best possible representation of what the society is, of your country is. And so yes, I like gender quotas. In politics and in business as well. Of course, it has to be good people. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So, I suppose most of the criticism for gender quotas would come on social media. So this question is actually quite poignant, I suppose. So Anne Spahn asks, you speak of the importance of people to be able to freely express themselves. Do you believe that social media platforms such as Twitter have positively impacted the broadcast of human rights issues?
I mean, I think it's democratizes the discussion. So you have access, many people have access. But of course, as everything, it has a good part and a bad part, because also we have seen through social media the spread of hate speech, xenophobic speech. And in the cases like in Myanmar, I mean, it was through social media that started all this very terrible hate speech against the Rohingyas before the genocide in 2017. So I think social media is important, and the world has changed and social media is part of it, but it can produce negative effects like hate speech. Many percent, for example, we're talking about hate speech. Even in the European Union, 40% of female parliamentarians have been under attack through social media, even threats of rape and things like that. So I mean, I like social media, but I think we need to be careful about it in terms of how we ensure freedom of expression. but we try to avoid misinformation and so on.
Great. Another one of the questions here is quite a short one. Who are your role models?
Huh?
Who are your role models? What kind of people do you look up to, or who would inspire
My
you?
models, you mean? I don't know. I mean, I don't. Well, I usually, I would say when I was asked in the past, which is a politician that you respect the most, I would have said Madiba, you know, because I thought that that fantastic South African president, he was so many years in prison, but still no sense of revenge, the sense of how to have one Mandela, I meant, because they call it Madiba, but it's Mandela, Nelson Mandela. And the idea of we are one nation, and I think he's the one who has represented me the best.
Definitely a worthy choice. We have another question here from one of the lecturers in Trinity who asks, hopefully I get this right now, notwithstanding the commitment that states are supposed to make when taking a seat on the UN Human Rights Council or when serving on a human rights treaty, monitoring bodies, doesn't it cause legitimacy problems for the UN human rights system when states with well-documented records of systematic human rights abuses, for example, states that engage in torture or discriminate openly against women or minorities, sit on these bodies? There does not seem to be much evidence that states with poor human rights records have reformed themselves based on their participation in the UN human rights bodies.
Well, I think I answered that because you asked me about that before. That I mean, first of all, if you had in the UN, not Human Rights Council, only countries who behave, I don't know how many countries you will have there. We are 193 member states in the UN. And the UN is the member states. I mean, it's not us, the bureaucrats, it's the states, because they're the ones who make decisions. And it's difficult. I mean, and as I told you before, when member states put their candidacy to different councils, they have to make pledges and they have to show how they are, which is how their performance is. So it's true, there are countries you can ask, but anyway, even if they're sitting there, they will be scrutinized. They will be, I mean, we have countries who are sitting in the Human Rights Council, but the Human Rights Council resolves to make commission of inquiries or to, you know, to pass resolution against what's going on in that country. So it doesn't mean that there will be, I mean, it's not necessarily a conflict of interest, if I may say. And of course, what I would like, sitting on the Human Rights Council or not, I would like every country to respect human rights anyway.
We just have two more here before I let you go. Anya Doyle asks, would you say the human rights issues can best be tackled at a local, national, or an international level? Or does it have to be all three?
I think it has to be all three. Because, I mean, every country needs to respect, promote, and protect human rights at the national level. But of course, you also, I mean, and of course, because there is this discussion, are human rights individual? Yes, every individual deserves their human rights to be protected. But in today's world, we also have collective rights. For example, climate change will affect all of us, and we all need to be responsible in terms of how we develop from our personal behavior to global resolutions, to global responses. So I think on the three levels is important, and also at a regional level as well, because every region has its own challenges, its own issues, and need to consider how they respond to those challenges. And I have to tell you, I mean, even Europe being, I mean, for being a South American, Europe was always for us like the model of human rights. But then when you're here, you find out that you also have Roma people who are not having all the best, I mean, the protection of their human rights, or of course, migrants and refugees and so on. So I think we need it at all levels.
Thanks very much for that. We just have one more question before I let you go. So Chile has just voted last month to abolish its constitution and to replace it with something new. What are your hopes for this process? And do you think that there is a realistic chance for Chile's new constitution to reflect a human rights-centered approach? And if so, what might this mean?
Well, I think that was a fantastic thing because I did do that exercise in my last government, but it was not, I mean, we launched an exercise of people discussing our constitution and thinking which were the main issues for a new constitution. 200,000 people participated in that exercise, but and I sent a bill based on what the majority of the discussion of the people they came from at houses they discussed, at the neighborhoods, and then of course communal, regional, and national level. And I sent a bill to the parliament, but the current government did not proceed with that. They froze it. So people wanted a new constitution. They were in the streets last year, I mean, like in many other parts of the world, against, poverty, inequalities, and they decided that they want a new constitution. So the plebiscite on 2 Sundays ago, I think was fantastic because, first of all, before, I think after, when we decided to come back to democracy, we had a plebiscite, and this was the most important voting because 7.5 million people participated, the highest number ever. So not all of them voted for a constitution, like 5 million something, I mean, but it was like 70-something%, 78% or something like that. So I think it's a great opportunity. First of all, a lot of young people went because they have a lot of hope that a new constitution, because a new constitution isn't about thinking how you can build. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I hope I don't say any inadequate thing with lawyers, but at the end, it should reflect a society where you want to live in, how people can coexist in the best possible way, how you will relate state and market, for example. I mean, there's so many different things. And of course, for the majority of people, it's about having better access to health, to education, to opportunities, and to rights. So I think next April, the people who are going to write the constitution will be elected directly. And the other interesting thing, because there were two forms. One was called a mixed convention, and that meant that half would be parliamentarian and half would be directly elected, but that was not the option that won. The option that won is everybody would be elected. Of course, you can be a parliamentarian, you can run. But the interesting thing, for the first time, 50% women and 50% men. And I think that will be fantastic. It will be people who will write the constitution will have to be 50 and 50, and that, I think, will represent better the society where everybody wants to live.
Brilliant, brilliant. Sorry, there's one last one here. I'm really sorry about this. It's quite short. It's what would your advice for young women entering the workforce be?
In politics or in workforce or what?
Just the workforce in general, in any walk of life.
Well, I think I would say, well, it will depend, of course, in where you live, because there are places where women go into workplace, but it's in informal economies, and they have no rights. So, but in the workplace, I would say believe in yourself, have self-confidence. Women are capable of fantastic things, and defend your opinions, and many times the problem is the tone more than the concepts. So if you do it respectfully, be confident on yourself, be a good team player. That's what I would say.
Brilliant, brilliant. Listen, I'm worried that we've gone slightly over time here, but thank you so much for speaking to us today. I really, really appreciate it. And
thank you, Jonathan. All the best. Huh?
Thank you.
Bye.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.